Imagine this. You walk into a room where everyone is smiling. They're discussing a topic, maybe politics, maybe religion, maybe something that's supposed to matter deeply. And they all agree. Same phrases, same conclusions, same tone. It feels safe, harmonious. But something gnaws at you. You feel the faint hum of performance, like everyone rehearsed their lines before they arrived. You think of adding a contradictory idea, not even to argue, just to question. But something inside you freezes. A strange voice whispers, "Don't." Later, you're alone. That moment lingers. Why didn't you speak? The idea wasn't radical. It wasn't even offensive. It was simply yours. And yet you swallowed it. Now multiply that moment by every dinner table, classroom, Twitter thread, workplace, and church pew you've ever sat in. Slowly, quietly across the years, something has been taken from you. Or maybe you gave it up without noticing. Your mind, not your intelligence, your education, or your memory, but that rare, precious ability to think for yourself, to reach into the unknown and pull out a thought that wasn't pre-approved, pre-packaged, and pre-digested by someone else, to stand alone, even in confusion, rather than sit comfortably in collective illusion. But here's the most unsettling part. You didn't know it was happening. In fact, you might still believe it hasn't. You might say, "I have my own opinions." You might think, "I'm educated, I read, I'm informed." You might feel, "I've chosen my path." But what if none of that means what you think it does? What if the things you believe to be your own are simply echoes of someone else's thoughts, wrapped in your voice? What if the media you consume, the experts you trust, the moral codes you inherited, and even the words you use to describe reality were quietly planted there, not by a sinister villain, but by something far more dangerous? Culture, fear, habit, language, the desperate need to belong. What if you are not thinking, but merely reacting to a script written by 1,000 invisible hands? There's an ancient phrase you may have heard, "Know thyself." But how can you know yourself when the self you've come to know is a composite sketch of others' expectations? When the words you use to reflect inward are the same words used to manipulate you outwardly? Now ask yourself, when was the last time you changed your mind about something important, not because you were convinced, but because you discovered something that shattered your worldview? When was the last time you sat in uncertainty without rushing to fill it with someone else's answer? When was the last time you questioned not the world, but the lens through which you see it? Most people don't. Not because they're weak, not because they're stupid, but because they are afraid. Afraid of being wrong, afraid of being alone, afraid of being judged, afraid of standing at the edge of the known and peering into the void without a guidebook, a guru, or a Google search. And so, they follow. They wear opinions like uniforms, pass around outrage like communion, and label deviation as danger. Society rewards conformity with comfort. Dissent, true, radical thinking, is met with resistance, mockery, or silence, not because the ideas are flawed, but because they threaten the fragile scaffolding that holds collective identity together. But here's the paradox. Everyone claims to value independent thought. We praise critical thinking, free speech, diverse perspectives, and yet the moment someone truly deviates, thinks outside the tribe, sees through the veil, they are shunned, or ignored, or labeled mad. So what's really going on? How can a society that celebrates individuality produce so few individuals who actually think? How can a generation with infinite information have so little wisdom? Why do people who pride themselves on being open-minded shut down at the first sign of contradiction? Why does no one truly think for themselves? These aren't questions meant for entertainment. They're not just provocative, they are urgent, because the cost of unthinking isn't just personal, it's civilizational. When people stop thinking, tyrants rise, lies become truth, and reality becomes a curated illusion. But you feel it, don't you? That quiet rebellion stirring in your chest. That flicker of awareness that maybe, just maybe, something is wrong. Not just out there, in the media or in politics, but inside. A subtle paralysis. A mental leash you didn't know you were wearing. What if you could trace it back? What if you could find the source? What if the voice that froze you in that room wasn't yours at all? In the next breath, we'll go deeper. Not into conspiracy or opinion, but into the structure of the mind itself. The hidden mechanisms that shape your thoughts, your identity, your very sense of reality. And once you see them, you can never go back. It begins earlier than you think. Before you were conscious of yourself as a self, you were already being shaped. A mother's smile when you behaved, a teacher's frown when you questioned, a friend's silence when you said the wrong thing. Each moment etched into your nervous system, teaching you a rule, sometimes without a single word: think like them or be alone. And so, you learned, not just what to think, but how to think, or more precisely, how not to. Carl Jung once wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But before you can even approach that kind of self-acceptance, you must first meet yourself, the real self, the one buried under layers of inherited beliefs, unconscious fears, and borrowed language. But that meeting rarely happens because modern life is designed to distract you from it. From the moment you wake up, you are immersed in an ecosystem of signals, notifications, headlines, opinions, advertisements, trends, all telling you what matters, what's real, and who you should be. These aren't neutral signals. They're engineered to bypass your reasoning mind, to trigger emotion, urgency, tribalism, to keep you reacting instead of reflecting. Arthur Schopenhauer, the brooding German philosopher, believed that most people mistake the opinions of others for their own. He said, "The common man is not concerned with the truth, but with the approval of his neighbors. It's not a flaw of character, it's a feature of survival. In tribal times, belonging meant safety. Dissent could mean exile. And that old wiring hasn't disappeared." We are biologically wired for conformity. The brain is efficient but lazy. It seeks cognitive ease, the comfort of the familiar, the socially accepted, the already agreed upon. Thinking for yourself is metabolically expensive. It requires mental energy, emotional discomfort, and the courage to be wrong. So the mind builds shortcuts. Authority bias. If an expert says it, it must be true. Confirmation bias. If I already believe it, new evidence will support it. Groupthink. If everyone agrees, it must be right. Each bias is a defense mechanism, a way to shield us from the terror of uncertainty. But over time, they become more than just habits. They become identity. You stop asking, "What do I believe?" and instead ask, unconsciously, "What do people like me believe?" And this is where it gets darker. Because once your identity is fused with belief, the act of questioning becomes existential. You're no longer just reconsidering an idea, you're threatening the fragile sense of who you are. This is why you feel defensive when someone challenges your worldview. Why debates become wars and facts become weapons. It's not logic that's under attack, it's self, and the self clings to certainty the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, warned of this false self, the person who lives in bad faith, denying their freedom in order to escape responsibility. To think for yourself is to accept that no one is coming to save you. No ideology, no group, no system. You are alone with your mind and its terrifying power. But society rewards those who outsource that power. In school, you're taught to memorize, not to question. To follow rules, not to understand their origin. In media, you're fed narratives, not raw data. And in social spaces, you're trained to signal alignment, not to seek truth. Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, didn't fear censorship. He feared a population so drowned in distraction that they no longer cared about truth. In a world of infinite entertainment, the greatest danger isn't repression, it's indifference. And what of religion, morality, tradition? These too are double-edged swords. They can ground us in meaning, but they can also be used to program obedience. Carl Jung cautioned that every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism. Even noble ideals can become prisons when they're not chosen consciously. So here's the real problem. Most people aren't choosing their beliefs, they're absorbing them through osmosis, trauma, repetition. They mistake consensus for truth. They confuse confidence with wisdom. They conflate comfort with clarity. And as these inherited beliefs crystallize, a deeper mechanism kicks in. The ego, that mask we wear to navigate the world. The ego is not evil, but it is fragile. It survives by editing reality, deleting anything that might crack its illusion of control. Jung referred to the persona, the social self we present to the world. The problem is, over time, we forget it's a mask. We believe we are the persona. We forget the deeper self, the chaotic, intuitive, contradictory being underneath. And yet, that buried self remembers. It whispers in moments of silence, in late-night anxiety, in inexplicable sadness. It knows when you've betrayed your own mind to fit in. It knows when your thoughts aren't really yours. The philosopher Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, believed that meaning, not comfort, is the deepest human need, but meaning can only be found by confronting reality as it is, not as it's packaged for consumption. That confrontation begins in the mind. It begins with asking, what if everything I believe is just a story I've never questioned? But here's the paradox that traps most people. To question the story, you must step outside of it. But to step outside, you must already suspect that it's a story. And most never do. They live and die inside narratives they never wrote. They wear chains and call them virtues. They obey voices in their heads and call it conscience. But the system is clever. It doesn't need to silence you. It just needs to keep you comfortable, distracted, busy. And so the machinery spins, quiet, efficient, invisible. You live your life thinking you are thinking, when in truth, you're only remembering what you were told to think. But once you see the machinery, once you feel the gears turning, something breaks, and from that break, something new can emerge. What that something is depends on what you're willing to risk. Because now you face a choice: return to the illusion or dive deeper. And if you choose to keep going, the next truth will be harder. Because what this machinery does to you is far more devastating than how it operates. You don't notice it at first. The decline isn't loud or catastrophic. It doesn't arrive like a war or a storm. It happens slowly, like a room growing darker one shadow at a time. You adjust, you adapt, you call it normal. That is how the loss of thinking works. Not with an explosion, but with erosion. One day you realize you haven't had a real thought in months. You've had opinions, yes, reactions, preferences, but not thoughts. Real, original, soul-splitting thoughts that erupt from silence and leave you transformed. And this isn't just your story, it's collective. Look around, look at the surface of things. Trending hashtags, breaking news, viral outrage. Look at how people talk to each other, not to understand, but to signal, not to connect, but to win. Every conversation reduced to an echo of ideology. Every disagreement a threat to identity. This is what happens when no one thinks for themselves. The world turns into noise. It may appear vibrant, like a city lit with neon, but underneath the glow is a hollowing. Beneath the debates, the headlines, the philosophies and politics and philosophies about politics, there is fear, a deep ancestral terror of standing alone without a script. And so, we become reflections of reflections. We mimic beliefs because they're safe. We adopt values because they're popular. We perform outrage because it gives us a sense of moral identity, however fragile. But beneath all this performative certainty is something no one talks about, a quiet, creeping emptiness. We see it in anxiety statistics that skyrocket every year. We see it in the rise of shallow dopamine addictions, scrolling, swiping, binging. We see it in the sheer number of people who cannot be alone with their thoughts for more than a few seconds. This is no accident, because when you surrender your mind to others, when you outsource your perception of truth, beauty, meaning, identity, what's left inside? A shell. And the mind, stripped of its purpose, begins to rot, not biologically but existentially. This is where the damage becomes visible. People no longer trust their own instincts. They wait for someone else to define what's real. They hesitate before expressing a thought, unsure if it's correct. They crave constant validation, not because they're vain, but because their internal compass has been shattered. They've lost the ability to navigate reality. And when enough people lose that ability, something terrifying happens. Society becomes programmable. This isn't a sci-fi fantasy. This is behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, neuroscience. The human brain is plastic, malleable. Feed it the same idea long enough and it rewires itself to accept it as truth. This is how propaganda works, how cults recruit, how corporations sell identity disguised as lifestyle, how politics becomes religion, how advertising becomes ideology, how history gets rewritten, not with lies but with emphasis. We are told what to care about, when to care about it, and how intensely we must care, not based on truth, not based on reason, but based on narrative utility, what serves the machine. And we participate. We consume stories instead of investigating reality. We join mobs instead of asking questions. We outsource our anger, our hope, our grief, and our purpose. We become dependent, and dependence breeds fragility. Because when your identity is built on someone else's ideas, you must constantly defend them, not because you're sure they're true, but because you're terrified they're not. So you argue, not to understand, but to reinforce your reflection in the eyes of others. And when someone does think differently, radically, independently, you hate them. Not because they're dangerous, but because they remind you of what you gave up. This is the unseen consequence, resentment toward the free mind. You'll find it in how society treats visionaries while they're alive, mocking, silencing, exiling. Only in death are they sanitized and turned into quotes for coffee mugs. We worship dead prophets and crucify living truth seekers. Because independent thought is threatening. It breaks the spell. It reminds us that we could be free, but have chosen not to be. And what of the self? The internal consequence is even more tragic. When you live inside borrowed beliefs, your emotions begin to malfunction. You feel guilt not because you've done wrong, but because you've violated someone else's script. You feel anxiety not because of real danger, but because your thoughts are misaligned with your tribe. This is the birth of internal censorship, where the jailer lives in your own skull. You no longer need to be told what to think. You do it to yourself. You preemptively edit your thoughts. You silence your curiosity. You retreat into safety. This is what Carl Jung meant when he warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But why? Because the soul doesn't follow rules. It doesn't fit ideologies. It doesn't care about being liked or accepted. It wants truth, raw, painful, beautiful, inconvenient truth. And most people would rather be numb than true, because truth, real truth, demands sacrifice. It asks you to break your mask, to question the sacred, to lose your footing, to risk exile, to walk through the desert of unknowing. And yet, if you don't make that walk, if you avoid it your whole life, there's a consequence even more devastating than anxiety, dependency, or social manipulation. You die having never truly lived, because living without thinking is not living. It's reacting, it's imitating, it's surviving. But it is not life. Life begins the moment you question, the moment you stop running, the moment you pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, not what's right, not what's popular, but what is real, not for them, for you. And that question, that single trembling question, is the doorway to freedom. But freedom is terrifying, because it makes you responsible. It means you can no longer blame the algorithm, the government, your parents, your culture. You must reclaim the authorship of you. The mind. And that's where everything changes. But how? How do you rebel against a system that lives in your own thoughts? How do you break the spell without losing your soul? The answer isn't what you think, and it doesn't come from rage or rejection or escape. It begins with something far more radical, a new kind of courage, a rebellion of the inner world. Freedom doesn't start with a flag. It doesn't start with a slogan or a movement or a fiery speech. It starts in silence, in stillness, in the unsettling moment when you realize the voice inside your head isn't yours. And for the first time, you stop listening to it. That's the beginning. Not a rebellion of fists and fire, but of awareness. A rebellion that unfolds inside your own mind against every assumption you didn't know you had. It's not loud. It's not glamorous, it is lonely, terrifying, and necessary. Because to truly think for yourself, you must first admit you haven't been, and that's the hardest confession of all. But something happens the moment you make it. The fog begins to lift. You begin to hear the machinery humming beneath your thoughts, and then the work begins. Step 1. Stop consuming for comfort. Everything in modern life is designed to sedate you. Endless scrolling, constant noise, curated outrage. It numbs the pain of not knowing who you are. It fills the space where thought should live. So stop, not permanently, not dramatically, just pause. Turn it off. Be bored. Be uncomfortable. Sit in silence and feel what rises. It won't be pleasant at first. You'll meet every ghost you've avoided. You'll hear echoes of other people's beliefs pretending to be your own. You'll feel the pull of the tribal mind, begging you to come back. But sit with it. Because the mind, once still, begins to speak differently. Not in slogans, not in recycled headlines, but in questions. Not symbolism. Allow questions, deep ones. The kind that don't come from fear, but from curiosity. What do I actually believe? Where did that belief come from? Who benefits from me thinking this way? What if the opposite were true? That's the soil where thought begins to grow. But it takes more than questioning. You must also learn how to hold contradiction, because real thinking is not neat. It doesn't always end in answers. It requires dwelling in paradox, in not knowing, and most people aren't trained for that. They want black or white, right or wrong, hero or villain. But life isn't binary, and neither is truth. Nietzsche once said, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." That chaos isn't destruction. It's the collision of inherited certainty with inner revelation. That collision is where originality is born. And originality is power, but not the kind of power that dominates others. The power to see clearly, to stand outside the crowd and say, "I don't agree," not because it's edgy, but because it's true for you, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you, which leads to the next stage of rebellion. Practice losing status, because the moment you begin to think for yourself, you will lose things: approval, tribe, belonging, maybe even love. People might label you difficult or arrogant or dangerous, not because you are any of those things, but because you've stopped playing a role they needed you to play. The role of the agreeable friend, the compliant student, the predictable partner, the identity they could understand and categorize. You've stepped outside the script, and it threatens the system they still depend on. But here's the secret. When you can survive the loss of external approval, you gain something far more precious: sovereignty. You become internally anchored, no longer blown by the winds of popular opinion, algorithmic outrage, or social flattery. You become capable of silence in a room full of noise, capable of curiosity in the face of dogma, capable of compassion without conformity. And from that inner stability, something else begins to grow: discernment. You no longer ask, "Is this popular?" You ask, "Is this true?" You no longer seek the loudest voice. You seek the clearest one, often found in unexpected places. This is how you begin to rebuild your mind, not as a reflection of the collective, but as a sacred space, a forge, a sanctuary, a temple where ideas are tested, not blindly adopted. You read not to agree or disagree, but to be transformed. You speak not to be heard, but to reveal. You listen, not to reply, but to understand. And you begin to spot the difference between thinking and imitation. You realize how rare real thought is, and how dangerous, and how beautiful. You begin to find others, not many but a few, who are also rebelling. They may not look like you, talk like you, vote like you, or worship like you, but you'll know them by one thing: their minds are their own. And that kind of person is magnetic. Not because they agree with you, but because they make you think more deeply than you ever have. These people aren't gurus, they aren't influencers, they are mirrors, reflecting the freedom you're trying to build. And in their presence, you don't feel pressured to conform. You feel invited to awaken. Because the rebellion isn't about being different, it's about being authentic. Even when that authenticity is contradictory, even when it evolves, even when it isolates you. This rebellion, this inner revolution, is not about destroying systems. It's about transcending them. Because when enough people awaken to their own minds, the world doesn't just change from the outside, it changes from the inside out. But beware, there is no finish line. Thinking for yourself is not a destination, it is a discipline, a way of being, a lifelong practice of peeling away illusion, layer by layer, until what remains is not ideology or opinion, but presence. Real, raw, awake. That is the rebellion. Not to be right, not to be righteous, but to be real. And that, in a world of performance, is the rarest form of power. But there's one truth left, deeper than rebellion, deeper than clarity, deeper even than freedom. A truth that will dismantle even your desire to think for yourself, not to destroy it, but to transcend it. You've earned the silence to hear it. Are you ready? There comes a point in the journey where every question collapses into silence. Not because you found all the answers, but because you realize the questions were never yours to begin with. You began this path believing you were reclaiming your mind. You tore away the voices of culture, family, media, mentors. You dismantled the system. You faced the void. You chose your thoughts. You stood alone. But now you face something even more terrifying. What if even your own thoughts are not truly yours? This is not a riddle. It is a truth that shatters the very foundation of the self, because the mind, your thoughts, your preferences, your conclusions, is not a sovereign entity floating in a vacuum. It is shaped by trauma, shaped by memory, shaped by neurobiology, by childhood, by evolutionary pressures you didn't choose and cannot control. The voice in your head that says, "I think." What if that voice is simply a chorus of everything you've ever heard, stitched together by survival instinct and the illusion of continuity? What if thinking for yourself is not freedom, but another layer of delusion? This is where even rebellion becomes a mask. You didn't invent your language, you didn't choose your wiring, you didn't design the psychological laws of the human experience. So what is yours? Strip it all away, layer by layer. Beliefs, values, identity, ego, preferences, even thoughts. What remains? Awareness. Not awareness of something, just awareness. Still, silent, watching. Tao, the witness behind every thought, behind every emotion, behind every act of rebellion or conformity. The silent field in which all experience arises and fades. This is what the mystics tried to point to. What Jung glimpsed in the deep unconscious, what Nietzsche brushed against in eternal recurrence, what Schopenhauer called the will, and what Zen calls no mind, what Ramana Maharshi called the self, and what the Upanishads whisper as the immortal Atman. Not the mind, not the story, not the thinking, but the one who sees. And here, finally, the trap dissolves. Because the ultimate truth is not that no one thinks for themselves, but that there is no one to think for. The self you were trying to liberate was never solid. It was a ripple in the stream, a temporary pattern in the mind, a mask worn by consciousness to play a role in a fleeting dream. You can spend your whole life polishing that mask, trying to make it original, trying to make it yours, trying to make it right. But the deepest freedom comes not from controlling your thoughts, but from realizing you are not your thoughts. You are the space in which they arise. And from that space, something profound emerges. Not a better opinion, not a perfect ideology, not the right way to live, but presence, still, attentive, awake, no longer needing to grasp, defend, or declare, just being. This is the end of striving, the end of performing, the end of needing to be someone. Because in truth, you are not someone. You are the field in which someone temporarily appears. And when you rest in that field, you no longer fear thought, because thought is no longer your prison. You no longer chase truth, because you are no longer divided from it. You no longer seek validation, because there is no you to be validated. And in that absence, a new kind of life begins. Not the life of a thinker, not the life of a rebel, but the life of a witness, deeply rooted, infinitely free. You walk through the world, but no longer cling to it. You hear the noise, but it no longer commands you. You feel the pull of the tribe, but you are no longer seduced by it. Because you remember what most forget. The mind was never yours, and that is not a tragedy. It is your liberation. The world will keep spinning. People will keep echoing each other. The machinery will keep humming. But you will be still, not detached, not numb, but radically alive, because you are no longer inside the mind. You are watching it, with love, with awe, with silence. And in that silence, you will know a truth so powerful, so intimate, so piercing, that it cannot be spoken, only lived. So go, not to think more, but to see more clearly. And remember, the most powerful mind is the one no longer afraid to disappear.